and welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
The team at the Research Works podcast acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which we live and work. We pay our respects to all First Nations peoples, elders past and present, and would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast each week, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We recognise their continued connection to this beautiful budja we call home.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Research Works. Ash, hello.
Hello, Dana. How are you?
I'm very well. I have to say, I do have a bit of allergies today. Hay fever is at its peak. So I'm trying my best.
As am I.
We always get allergies at the same time.
We do. But it's our favourite time of the week.
It is. Wouldn't change it for the world.
It's podcast time. We have another guest from another time zone today. So we're always really appreciative of our international guests with their flexibility and staying up late for us. And on the podcast today is no exception. We have Dr. Samuel Logan. Welcome, Sam.
Welcome.
Oh, thanks for coming on.
Oh, yeah, it's so lovely to have you join us today. We're just looking forward to actually just delving into your paper, especially after speaking to some of your research colleagues just a few weeks ago. And your paper is called Powered Mobility Device Use and Developmental Change of Young Children with Cerebral Palsy. That was published in Behavioural Sciences in 2023.
Oh, very recent.
Very recent. Love it. So good.
I'm looking forward to seeing how this all fits together and, you know, how this work that you've done is just another piece of that mobility puzzle, which I think is really interesting and relevant for our listeners.
Absolutely.
So, but before we get stuck into the paper, let's tell everyone a little bit more about Sam. Sam Logan is an Associate Professor of Kinesiology in the College of Health at Oregon State University. He serves as Director of the Disability and Mobility Do-It-Yourself Cooperative. He received his PhD in kinesiology at Auburn University and completed a 2-year postdoc fellowship under the direction of Dr. Cole Galloway at the University of Delaware prior to joining faculty at Oregon State.
That's really awesome. That's really cool.
Very impressive.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for the introduction.
No
That's
problem.
very, very cool.
And that's obviously the formal getting to know you bit, Sam, but we also like to do our informal getting to know you, and that is our icebreaker question. And today's question, it's a bit of a ponderer. It could go a few different ways.
Okay.
What does the perfect day look like for you? That's quite a big question.
It is a big question.
Days are long.
It is a big question.
You know, lots of hours to fill in a day.
Yeah. But what would the ideal perfect day be? Sam, what is it for you?
Yeah, I would say, so we have a toddler at home, so it's always fun. She's turning 2 next month, and so every day is getting more and more fun with the things she's coming up with saying. So I will say some family time would be great. I think starting off the day with, reading a book and going for a nice long run, but then coming back to, to join the family for the rest of the day and finding something to do with everyone is pretty much the perfect day. I've been really lucky generally since she's been born that I haven't had quite a full schedule at OSU between sabbatical and leave and everything. Yeah. So I've almost been having, besides the not sleeping at night, having some version of maybe not perfect, but really good days for the last 2 years. So I've been super thankful for that.
Awesome.
Oh, that's amazing. And I can see there's a little peek out your window there and it looks like a beautiful day where you are.
So lovely.
Yes, it is. Yes, the temperature has gotten a bit cooler as we're heading into September, which has been a big relief. It's been unusually hot here, except for that's becoming more usual.
I know, it's definitely changing, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I love the idea of your perfect day, and I can see how all of those things put together would just make you feel good. Endorphins would be running, I would say. Yeah. I like how you said the run in the morning, because I would say that my most ideal perfect day would start with a really good run. But I'm very fussy about the weather, so I want it to be in degrees Celsius. It would have to be under 18 degrees Celsius. So when you go out there, you don't need to wear a jumper or a sweater. You can just get going and you get warm and you just see the scenery and the sun's just rising. You're like sunlight in your eyes and you have to do a good time as well. So you kind of know that you're just like, good.
Yeah.
And then you come home and you have you go out for a great breakfast, usually like an avocado smash or something like that.
Yep.
And then you plan a lovely lunch, which is always going out to eat for a nice lunch because I'm very food oriented, as you know. Probably
I knew this would be about food.
It'd be about food, right? And then my afternoon would be like watching something on Netflix or Amazon, something that I can watch, but I'm not really paying too much attention because it's like my time to do some work. Like when I say work, it's just because we love what we do. So you get to get into stuff. You have some creative space. I just like having something on to give it a bit of background noise. But I love just pottering around and thinking about stuff and having that space to think.
Yeah.
And that to me is a perfect day. I mean, end with a really good meal as well. So food.
Of course.
Hence the run in the morning.
By food.
Yeah, that's right. What about yours, Ash?
It would start. I love that you were thinking about temperature because I was doing the same thing. I'm like, what temperature would it be? And I think it would be a nice warm day, not too hot, warm enough to be able to go outside and enjoy doing outdoor things, but not so hot
like below 35 degrees Celsius.
Yeah. I'm thinking, 30.
30? Okay.
30 degrees Celsius.
Okay. No sweat.
No sweat.
Yeah.
I get to wake up in my own time.
Yes. Not by the children.
Not by the children. Okay. And then I get to go for a really nice long walk. And then a swim at the beach.
Ooh, nice.
And the water's really nice and fresh.
Yes, yeah.
And you feel really invigorated.
Yeah.
And then I'd just love to eat a really big stack of pancakes.
Can't go wrong with breakfast or dinner.
Yeah. And then whatever happens from there is a bonus, really.
I love how it's all about how we start our day. There's something about starting your day well that sets the tone for the rest of it, right?
Yes. And so I'm really into Australian rules football, Sam. We can talk about that later, what that is. But there's a footballer and his like really famous expression is win the morning, win the day.
Good.
And
it's true.
I think
it's true. Yeah. If you can get
it's
up
a
on
good way
time.
to start. That's for sure.
That's right. Otherwise, you're just playing catch up, right?
Yeah.
To have a nice segue into what we're talking about, all of it is about us self-initiating. Oh, is this cheesy or what? But it's all about us self-initiating, deciding what we want to do in our day. We have the freedom and the privilege of getting up and moving to do what we want to do, which is why...
What a segue. Into the abstract, mobility is a human right. And it is supported by the United Nations and the On-Time Mobility Framework. So the purpose of this study was to understand the effect of a powered mobility intervention on developmental changes in children with cerebral palsy. In this randomized crossover clinical trial involving 24 children aged between 12 and 36 months, children received both the Explorer Mini and a modified ride-on car in randomized order, each for 8 weeks. The Bayley Scales of Infant and Toddler Development, the 4th edition, was used at 3 time points. The results indicated that regardless of device, low use was associated with no significant developmental change and that high use was associated with positive developmental changes. This highlights that mobility access is critical to maximise the development of children with cerebral palsy and that this may be augmented by using powered mobility devices. So excited.
Good, right?
Yeah.
So good.
So good. And Sam, when we spoke with your research colleagues recently, we obviously covered this concept of mobility being a fundamental human right. Can you talk to us about how your work fits within this concept?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the overarching premise really stems from this idea that for a long time, the field has called this work early power mobility when we're providing these devices to children 3 and under. But then when you take a look really at typically developing kiddos and realizing that they're crawling by 6 or 7 months of age and walking by 12 months of age with some variability, of course. But why are we calling this early power mobility when we're really, in fact, late to their typically developing peers?
Yeah.
And so the overarching sort of idea behind this is to really advocate for equitable mobility experiences for children with disabilities beyond CP and really at a time of which their peers get mobile.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the overarching driving force behind at least the perspective behind this from a human rights perspective. Because I would even say too, just that, let's, for example, say none of the research ever panned out ever about providing powered mobility to young kids. You could still make the case from this human rights perspective that they deserve that autonomy and independence, regardless of what the research says or doesn't say.
Yeah.
So I think, while it certainly influences how we think about everything, beyond even just the research side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that, the way you described it there as well. We've always been a little bit late, yet we call it early.
Yeah.
So it'd be worthwhile just delving into sort of what is currently being done with powered mobility, and how is it currently used, and how is it currently being prescribed?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big question.
Yeah, I know. It is. So deceiving, one simple question, right?
Yeah, because especially, we've been involved in this from a research perspective for, over a decade now. And sometimes it's easy to forget that not every kiddo is discharged from the hospital with a powered mobility device who may have some mobility limitation.
Yeah.
And I think it's always important for us to really continue to talk to caregivers and families and kiddos and people with disabilities who use powered mobility devices to really understand what is actually happening in the real world.
Yeah.
And so, I'd say that there is quite a large number of people and kiddos who are getting access to powered mobility as young as 12 months, 36 months, like we did in our study. But it certainly is not widespread access.
No.
We'll talk about the ride-on cars, I'm sure, at some point, but just the idea that until March of 2020, when Promobile released the Explorer Mini, which is a powered mobility device specifically for children 12 to 36 months, there hasn't been a commercially available device in the United States anyway, specifically for that population. Over the years, there's been other experimental devices. There's been other people modifying ride-on cars and robots, and there's certainly been some options. But it wasn't, at least from sort of my perspective, it wasn't really until 2020 where this large manufacturing company made this product that was really specific for this age group.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
somewhat available.
Yeah.
Of course, it cost almost $3,000.
Yeah.
And insurance may never cover it.
Yeah.
And so, I think generally kids as young as 6 months old have used powered mobility devices, either in research or in practice.
Yeah.
And there's a whole large-ish body of research that suggests certainly some positive outcomes as a result of gaining access to mobility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But whether, I think there's still a long way to go in terms of every or nearly every or even the majority of kiddos who could use the device actually getting access to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that process being equitable, I think, is an important one to think about. And obviously you touched on cost being a potential barrier to children and their families being able to adopt powered mobility. But can we talk about some of the other barriers to the uptake of powered mobility?
Yeah. So there's a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think, I think of like the first one is device provision. So how do people even, families even become aware that these devices exist for their kiddos?
Yeah.
And so, that's sort of like the first step. And that often happens in collaboration between families and therapists.
Yeah.
Dr. Lisa Kenyon and colleagues had a paper out a few years ago showing that therapists hold positive views of powered mobility for young children, but few actually engage in powered mobility tasks with the kiddos that they treat.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole ecosystem of if a family is aware of a device, if the therapist recommend a device, because the next step, even if you want one, is then how do you get one?
Yeah.
And so that's where
there's just the logistics. And there's a lot to think about, even just from a logistics perspective, isn't there?
Yeah.
And,
I think about the visibility as well, you know, like families would probably see older children in powered mobility devices and that's relatively commonplace now, but I don't know that children of parents of younger children would necessarily see younger children in mobility devices and think, oh, I could ask about that for my child.
Right, yeah. And if the therapist hasn't really brought it up with them, it's kind of like, oh, is it even relevant for me? And Sam, I'm really interested in that really main thought, and we did speak about briefly with Heather as well, which was last on the show, is there is sometimes this perceived barrier that if my child uses power mobility at too young of an age, it interrupts with their development, their motor development. And that's always a big thought process. What's been your experience with that?
Yeah, so far there's been no evidence to support that. It's a common misperception as of now. As a researcher, we're trained very hard never to speak in absolutes. So there's always a possibility, of course, but I think there's been one randomized controlled trial with 28 kiddos that Dr. Jones and colleagues put out 10 years ago at this point. But between the experimental group that got the power mobility device and the control group that did not for some period of time, they did not show any differences on gross motor skills between the groups. So not a total, experimental design to ask that specific question, but it was a randomized controlled trial and no evidence to suggest that. I would say the current study that we'll talk more about today would also suggest that that's not the case given the trends that we saw with especially high use and the potential to gross motor changes. So it's I think it mirrors too the language debate that has been ongoing for a long time of if you teach kiddos sign language, they'll delay their verbal speech. And it seems as though that's not the case, of course, and that they actually complement each other and only enhance each other in different ways from having these multiple modes of communication. So I expect it's similar to that, but it's not always intuitive necessarily.
And it's amazing how strong that perception might be. It would be based on your own perspective without having based on any evidence necessarily. And somehow that narrative has sort of run out there, which is why I think now that we talk about it, everyone's like, oh, wow, isn't that amazing? It could be really something you could use. And so it leads me to the topic, and you broached it a little bit before as well, in terms of modified ride-on cars. We've had some experience doing that as well. It's not too difficult thing to do. You can get a little car from, you guys have Kmart or Walmart, Target, we've got some similarities. Right. And then you can adapt them, and you can find online things of how you can adapt them. But I thought it'd just be worthwhile going into, what modified ride-on cars actually are. I know there's pictures of that in your paper, but for a more audio perspective, how do you describe what a modified ride-on car is?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so this is taking off-the-shelf ride-on toy cars. And those are, the Barbie Jeep is a pretty famous example. So taking that toy off the shelf and modifying it in two ways to make it more accessible for children with mobility limitations of some kind. The first modification is making the switch more accessible to make the car go. So a lot of times these cars will come with foot pedals that require, foot and leg activation to make it go. And so you can use a large, really easy to press adapted switch and wire it to the car and place that on the steering wheel. So it takes very light pressure. It's a big surface area to hit, and that can make the car go. And that's obviously a big piece. And then the second one is just making sure that the kiddos are safe in the cars. And so using low cost and do-it-yourself materials like Velcro and pool noodles and kickboards to build a seating support system that's based on each individual child's needs. So
I love that. And it's
I will say,
simple.
go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just going to say that it's kind of this double-edged thing with the modified ride-on cars too, because because they are low cost, it can be as little as $200 for everything you need, plus some time and a manual.
Yep.
So it's really cool. It's really great. I've seen probably 1,000 kiddos get mobility for the first time and ride on cars, and
So cool.
it's great every single time. I mean, some kiddos don't like it, but for the most part, it's kids get cruising pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But the existence of people needing to DIY their own powered mobility device highlights this total systemic failure of the medical rehab industry.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, it's great and that we can do this, but then also it really just highlights a major failure of this whole pipeline of mobility access for kiddos.
Yeah. I think about any time I try and DIY something and how successful and not successful that ends up being. And like you say, it's something that could be done perfectly for these children and what they need, and it's such a gap.
It is. It really is, isn't it? So I think you've described it really nicely. Thank you for the visual. I think everyone can sort of see that. And then the other one that before we go into the study now is just the Explore Mini. So that's obviously a more specific to our population. It's not something that you modify, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So the Explore Mini is really it's a major leap forward in terms of the device design itself. So it looks like a toy. The main advantages it has to a ride-on car include it has a joystick for control. So rather than a single switch where you press it and go, and the steering is pretty challenging on ride-on cars. Yeah. The joystick is a lot easier to press. Not easier to press, but offers more capabilities for exploring the environment once kiddos get a handle on it.
Yep.
It comes with speed control, so different speed options.
Ooh, very good.
It has a 360-degree turning radius.
Very
you can really
good.
cruise in and out of couches and tables in the kitchen.
Very agile.
Every which way.
Yeah.
And then one of the major features of it is also that you can drop out the seat and kiddos can use it in standing as well.
Oh,
so it's meant to sort of grow with the kids if and when they're able to shift the physical skills that they're using to use the device.
Yeah. That's really cool. And again, there's a photo of that in your paper as well, but it's very cool.
Yeah. And can you get it kind of Barbie themed or not?
They do have I think the Barbie licensing is probably too expensive, especially at this past summer for us. But they do have a few different themed designs, which is handy.
That's really neat.
Good. It's actually really important, isn't it? Yeah. No, that's really cool. I love that. Yeah.
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 Of course, the challenge is, compared to $200, it's
that's
nearly
right.
$3,000
of course.
States dollars, and I believe it requires a doctor's prescription to get access to it through the typical channels.
Right.
Sure.
Okay.
So,
yep. A few barriers with that one now. Yeah. Well,
I mean, you could in about 4 hours, if you were motivated and had a couple $100s and some tools, you could have a modified ride-on card by the end of the day.
Wow.
But for the Explorer Mini, between funding and timeline, it's a very different picture.
Yeah. And the fact that it can, to an extent, kind of grow with your child, I suppose that's one of the other advantages.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the goal for a lot of kiddos may be to eventually walk out of that device.
Yeah.
And especially for, some kiddos aren't necessarily considered for power mobility because they are going to walk eventually. But this device and the ride-on cars as well, really anything that can be provided to these the younger ages, kiddos of many different abilities can use them for a period of time that works for them, depending on.
And that makes sense.
sort of
I know,
their own context.
you know, even if you've got kids who are presenting with GMS level 1 and 2, you know they're going to be walking independently with varied restrictions possibly, but there's still a delay at the beginning. You know, at 12 months, most of them aren't on their feet yet.
Yeah.
And, but their peers are already doing so. So, you know, that gap is already starting to happen. So you can see how having options very early on, and again, framing it within mobility being a fundamental human right, reframes a lot of things. It makes you sort of think a lot earlier rather than going, they're going to walk.
No, we're not going to wait.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, Sam,
I think that really connects. Oh, I was just going to say that really connects to that one-time mobility framework too. This idea of
that's right,
multimodal, of just being able to use many different devices and options for getting around. Depending on the kiddo and the context and the environment and the day and the hour.
That's good.
You know, that's what we do as adults. And so
that's right. Yeah.
There's a strong reason to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well.
For sure. So, Sam, all those things considered, can you talk us through the aims of your study? What did you set out to do and find out?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were really interested in looking at both of these devices, both the ride-on car and the Explore Mini, because up until this point, we had worked primarily with the modified ride-on cars over the last decade. Yeah. And with the release of the Explore Mini, we really wanted to have a comparative sort of study design so we could at least start to understand what the differences between the two are. And so the first aim was about comparing device use, whether it be low or high, of both the Explore Mini and the ride-on car, and how that relates to developmental changes as measured by the Bayley 4.
That's great. Yeah.
And so the second aim was then wanting to look at children's individual pathways of their developmental change on the Baileys, considering device use and GMFCS levels as well.
That's really cool.
So I think that's a bit different from what you often see, you know, in research. Everything's about the group mean differences. And we know there's so much variability in CP and, you know, kids and families and device use and all this. So we really wanted to emphasize this idea of, well, what's happening at the individual level, and are there any trends that come out of it?
Yeah, that's really awesome.
Yeah.
And then the participants that were in your study, I know we've already sort of said they're 12 to 36 months, right? What other characteristics was this population?
Yeah, so they were all either diagnosed with cerebral palsy or had a high probability of a future CP diagnosis based on their birth history or developmental status. And it included 24 kiddos. I think we had 23 in this paper because one family we didn't have the use data for. But the 12 to 36 months, as you mentioned. And I think a couple of strengths of the sample of these kiddos was that it was spread out across 3 different geographic regions.
Right.
So 3 sites. It was Washington State, Oregon State, and Michigan. And so that geographic diversity is helpful. And then, you know, when you talk to people outside of pediatric power mobility and you say you had 23 kids, like, oh, that's all. But this was one of the larger studies.
That's right.
Especially at this age as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And the specific diagnosis of CP or high likelihood. You know, often we've included kiddos of a wider age range and different kinds of disabilities to show, you know, feasibility and first steps and everything. But there's a lot of strengths of including the final group of kiddos that we did for this study.
And Sam, talk us through the intervention. What did you have the children and their families do as part of this study?
Yeah, so they each used both devices at different times for an 8-week period. So we would measure them on the Baileys. They would use either the Explore Mini or the ride-on car for 8 weeks. We would measure them again on the Baileys, and then they would use the other device for another 8 weeks. And the device order and everything was counterbalanced and randomized. We did all that. And we did not provide a specific amount of time for the families to use the cars.
Yeah.
Yep.
We know from past work that you can tell families whatever you want to tell them, and they're going to do whatever they can with whatever
That's right.
time they have available.
Yeah,
for sure.
So the intervention itself was fairly limited to, here's the device. We did do some check-ins a couple of times throughout the different periods just to make sure, the ride-on car was working, and if they had any questions, and not leave them totally on their own.
Yeah.
But it really was about them using each of these devices in whatever way they could during
That's cool.
their respective 8-week periods.
Yeah, it's very pragmatic.
It
and
is.
I love how transferable it makes your results. You're looking at it, it's not in this vacuum of an RCT or anything like that, just looking at real life and what that looks like and what changes you see as a result of that.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, this is certainly the kind of work that we've gravitated towards and we know there's, advantages and disadvantages of, you can't always make the strongest conclusions, but we also feel like it's important to keep in mind the real life circumstances of families as best we can. So trying to balance that as always.
Yeah, and what we're asking of families,
that's
as part of research as well, like especially for these families who probably get approached to do lots of different research studies and they give so much of themselves to research.
Yeah.
So I think, anything that just slots into life and they don't have to, it's much more organic, I think is really advantageous for them.
I think so too. And I even love your assessment, the Bayleys, which is a very comprehensive assessment with all these subscales. But I love that it wasn't, sometimes you can get into the danger of having way too many assessments because you want to find out all the answers to everything. Yeah. But there's a lot of assessment burden associated with that too, right?
Absolutely.
For the researcher to look at so much data. But you're really specific about wanting to look at their developmental motor outcomes. And so the Bayleys was perfect for that because that at the end of the day, I guess the Bayleys is very useful because of the different subscales. Do you mind just going through some of those subscales because I think we'll probably draw them out in the results, I suppose. Yeah. I feel like Bayley's is always one everyone talks about, but the results are pretty huge. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there are, 5 subscales. There's cognitive, receptive communication, expressive communication, fine motor, and gross motor. And so for this study, we used change scores and looked at percent of change of their raw scores over time. And we felt that was the best approach for this specific study.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, very individual, looking at the individual changes and pathways, right?
Yes. And, the normative data on the Bayleys, it doesn't exist for kiddos with CP. And so it's, there's always some pushback to use the, transfer your raw scores to the standardized scores. And, we felt like the intervention period was short enough and that those normative values weren't really going to answer the kinds of questions we were interested in for the study itself.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. That's a really good point. And you used the Bayley at baseline at the start and then after each 8-week block of access to the device. Is that right?
Exactly. Yep. And since everyone was randomized and device order was randomized, you hope that you're able to make better conclusions than if we hadn't done those things.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah. Let's get into the results because they are beautifully presented in the figures in the paper. So I would encourage everyone listening to go and have a look at the paper and these figures because they're amazing. You looked at each of the subscales of the Bayley and identified pathways from there. What were your main findings?
Yeah, so I'll shout out we had an undergraduate student, Dinah Schultz, who was very helpful I had the very, very messy versions of these figures. And she spent a lot of time, probably more than she'd be willing to admit, to line up everything as best as she could. So
we love a tech savvy student.
Yeah, that's right. That's awesome.
Yes. So we found that for high use of the Explorer Mini, there was significantly greater change compared to low use on receptive communication, expressive communication, and gross motor skills.
Wow.
And for the modified radon car, we saw no significant differences between low and high use. One potential explanation for that, for the radon car, was the vast majority of families were categorized as low use.
Okay.
And there were only a few that were in the high use group. So one potential explanation for that finding might be just the unequalness of those that used the device high and low as we classified them.
And what was how did you define low use and high use? What was the threshold there?
Yeah, so we defined low use as 480 minutes or less across 8 weeks. And that averages out to about 20 minutes a day for 3 days a week, which is when we recommended that ballpark before. It's been challenging for families to reach that. And so we kind of define that as low use. And then anything more than that, we defined as high use for this study.
That's really interesting then. So there's obviously some dosage element here, the more you use it. And I guess going back to, there's so much to discuss, but going back to the on-time ability framework and just the perspective of how much, toddlers would move in a day, how many times they would fall and get back up again and learn, there's a lot of repetition there. Yeah. And that's obviously a dose, frequency obviously is part of the one of the domains of the framework. Was that what you guys were thinking as well in terms of just dosage and frequency, or was there more to do with the fact that the Explorer Mini had more features that allowed more exploration? That's really cool.
Yes. So yes, results beget more questions. So that's one of the things that we, that's one of the goals is to figure out, is it something about the device? So the joystick capability that allows them to navigate in more spaces with more people, that exposes them to more language and more exploratory experiences, or was it simply high use of any device? And if we would have had more families that had used the ride-on car in the high use group, would they have had experiences that could have also encouraged developmental change? And so I think, that's one of the drawbacks of the comparative case study, is that everyone got both devices. And so that can be a little challenging to tease out. And dose this, that's like the $1 million question, because there really isn't any evidence-based guidelines to say you should use this 5 times a day for 20 minutes a day. And it's a complicated question, and also because, while keeping families in mind, we also don't want to, we're always battling with, we don't want to prescribe mobility for 5 days a week for 20 minutes a day. Because it's about a lot more than just adhering to a physical therapy program. There's a lot more that goes into mobility.
There's the content, right? It's the richness of the program. And
I'm pleased you brought that up, because I was just thinking about, as you were talking, when you start allocating a dosage or a prescription to the mobility device, you take away a lot of that self-initiated, self-directed opportunity to move.
That's right.
And it becomes another component of therapy rather than
life exploration.
Assistance to interact with your environment.
Yeah, and you can see, if you prescribe a certain amount of families, does driving down a hallway with no one else around and you get your minutes, an expectation of change. And how does that experience compare to half that time? But in a gymnasium setting with 10 peers of similar age and
that's right,
5 adults around and all kinds of things happening. So dosage is, you can't necessarily separate dosage from context, and that also becomes
But it's
more questions.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's not the central part. I think, activity-based funding, we've spoken about this with Andrew Whitehouse before, and, a lot of services are built on activity. So how many hours you provide is how the organisation might get paid, whether through a hospital or through an insurance scheme. So that becomes so central. But I go back to what Professor Ros Boyd said was, she's like, well, we need to look more on the ingredients. I don't think dosage is all that it is. It's probably less about dosage, because if you're not doing the right things, you don't have the right ingredients, then it doesn't matter how much you might do.
Yeah. We talked about that with Yannick
as well. Yeah, true.
Yeah.
And the vitalness of being motivated and having it self-initiated. There's no point doing what they were doing 90 hours over 2 weeks or something, which was a lot.
Yeah.
But there's no point doing that if you're not going to have the right ingredients.
Yes.
It's a bit of a waste of time, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right on, because, for this, it was the device itself was the intervention, and families did whatever they wanted to do to make it work. And but what is intervention? Is it just providing the device? Is it providing the device with activities? Is it combination?
Yeah.
So I think that's totally right on.
Yeah. And it's truly working with the family. You know how we always say, involve the family, work with the family. This is where it's really true to that whole coaching model, motivational interviewing, right, with Ben Jackson. It's about really, truly working with the family. In my head, I kind of go, if you have a child that's really grisly and crying, they might not have the communication to let you know what is wrong.
Yeah.
We know that for many toddlers, they might not be able to communicate that either, but they just want something. So maybe that's a great opportunity to put the child into the Explorer Mini or into the ride-on car and get them to go to where they want to go and show you what they want. That's the intervention rather than 20 minutes 5 times a week.
And then your 20 minutes is up. Out you get.
That's
we're
right.
going to go do something different now.
It ends naturally, but it starts naturally as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of from one of our earlier studies of a family who was using the ride-on car as an intervention. And the kiddo was diagnosed with cortical vision impairment, among a couple other diagnoses.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really clear what she could see. And I wasn't there for this. This was the story that was relayed from mom. But from about 30 feet away, there was an orange cat that came out from behind the shed, and the kiddo pointed to it and drove to it. And Calvin is now a part of the family, last I heard. And that's it did 2 things. One, it totally changed the perceptions about what she could see, which changed the opportunities of activities.
Yeah.
And then it also, there's now this family pet, and you can't measure that, you can't measure that in a research study. But that might be the most impactful finding we've ever really documented in terms of changing a family's relationship with their child.
I love that.
And a cat that's not scared of a powered mobility device. That's pretty incredible.
Did you say it was an orange cat as well?
I believe so, yes.
That's awesome.
I love that. What a great
really
story.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's the stuff we live for. Yeah.
Definitely. Sam, I'm interested, because you had the full spectrum of GMFCS levels in this study, didn't you? Were there any findings, relevant to GMFCS level that you had?
Yeah, not particularly. I believe for a couple of the subscales, there might have been a couple of small trends that we found. But I would say overarchingly, the vast majority, there was not much differences that we saw from the trends between GMFCS levels.
Wow.
That's cool.
Yeah, that is really
I really
cool.
like that. Yeah. And again, I guess that highlights what you were saying before about, one of the perceived barriers and using powered mobility. You just provide an opportunity. So for the GMFs level 1s and 2s, still go for it, because it's an opportunity. If you're 4 and 5, it's not a barrier. It's just go with it, and you're going to see some motor changes. Wasn't interrupted. I think that's really powerful. It goes a long way.
And in reality, just even if all the families had high use across devices, it's still not several hours a day. And so there is room for this and physical therapy and everything else.
Sure.
So I think
it doesn't take away.
It's not mutually exclusive. I think all of these things can complement each other and not negatively affect each other either.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a great message. So Sam, where to from here? What's next for you and this amazing work that you're doing?
Yeah, so same research group. We are hoping to do some bigger work and really start to tease out. We're going to stick with the Explore Mini for some future work, knowing that it was easier for families to use it more than the ride-on cars.
Yeah.
So hopefully going to focus on the Explore Mini some more and hopefully try to answer some of these questions that we've kind of talked about today of just having families use the Explore Mini alone.
Yeah.
Perhaps having a control group, even though we've been super hesitant and resistant to control groups because we've shown some benefits such early on. But really just trying to figure out, I think dosage is important, even if within the context of what does the intervention look like and starting to understand what dosage is such a clinical and medical term, but really, how much can families use it and what are the effects of that? And it seems important to start to understand that a bit more. That can really guide evidence-based guidelines, which may influence practice, which may influence funding access.
Policy.
That's some of the next steps.
Yeah.
I think more broadly, just from a industry perspective, it would be great if a toy company could make a ride-on car that just was accessible off the shelf. I mean, it's
100%.
We're not really talking about big design changes.
Yeah, that's a good call out. I like it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. Well,
we'll start our campaign.
I was thinking, what can we do? Because I think it's so important. And look, the importance of it was probably something I'll hand over to Ed because I'm sure he's been listening with lots of burning questions. Who knows? He's giving me a look. We don't know what question he has. So let's go into the next segment, which everybody loves, which is called Tell It to Ed. Ed, as you know, is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, but he has been listening to this episode ever so intently. So, Sam, here's an opportunity for you to summarize your research in about 60 seconds or so. And in turn, Ed will have time for one question. One question.
One question.
Take it away, Sam.
Okay, so I would say the main take-home message from this study was that powered mobility device use, especially high use of the Explore Mini, seemed to be related to positive developmental changes for young children with cerebral palsy. And the second point I would say is sort of regardless of device, whether it was the ride-on car or the Explore Mini, there seemed to be some patterns and trends of individual differences that higher use tended to gravitate towards positive change.
That's cool.
I have some extra time, but that
was
nailed
good.
it.
That was on point.
So succinct.
Well done. Really, really good. All right, Ed, over to you.
Oh, so we've had some of Sam's professional colleagues on the podcast a little earlier, and I think I'm going to ask a very similar question to the one that I asked then.
Okay.
So obviously, understanding that it's about the advocacy for mobility equity. So advocacy exists because of a lack of action on a matter. So I guess how are mentalities being changed for families, clinicians, and other professionals, given that there's this existing train of thought that says the quality of movement is more important, concept of doing it right rather than just finding ways to do it in general. What efforts at both a high and more macro level are being undertaken to drive this change, especially in terms of the general public? I don't know if that's really broad, but it's a similar question to what I asked a couple of weeks ago.
It's a good question, yeah. Take it away, Sam.
It's a question that we're always asking ourselves, and we haven't figured it out yet.
Okay.
Because it is this complex system of families and therapists and industry that all come together in order to provide access to young children who, frankly, don't have a say in their medical decisions until they're much older. And so while while this mobility advocacy perspective is all about the kids, in many ways, it has to be about everyone else besides the kids. And so I think just trying to relay the importance and privilege that typically developing kids have in their mobility patterns and ability to be autonomous and independent, and the right to be troublemakers and say no and get in trouble and do all the things that kids do that as parents we don't always love in the moment, but are also thankful that our kids have that opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
And I think trying to translate that message, that's really all the goal is here, is for kids to be kids. And it can happen in different ways. It's not to say that kids who struggle with their mobility aren't kids in their own ways. It's just this idea of trying to provide that mobility access so they can be independent as much as they are interested in being.
Yeah. And it's things like what you were saying, toy companies making ride-on cars that are accessible.
Yeah.
So that people don't have to, spend the time and effort doing those DIY modifications so that their child has something to be mobile with.
Yeah.
We should start a petition.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. All for. But yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we could be looking at, and it really starts with even the people who are listening to this podcast. We're clinicians, and how can we get that message out as well of mobility being a fundamental human right, and how can we start these conversations with families and reassuring them right from the beginning, this is not going to take away from your motor development.
It's not early, it's on time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so very, very much for being on the show today, Sam.
Thank you again for inviting me to be on the podcast today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the study, and I'm super excited that you were able to talk to my colleagues the other day as well. I'm interested to hear their episode, and just thank you again for the opportunity, and hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And to all of our listeners, remember you can head to our website, researchworks.net. If you want a copy of this paper, we'll have links there and a bit more information about Sam there too, so you can follow the team's work. But for now, we'll say thank you so much, and we'll talk to you all again next time.
All
right. See you guys. Bye.
Bye.